connect climate change and healthcare.
It's always been about protecting people
as good stewards of the environment and also solving their water shortage issues.
Green energy is one path that's well worth taking.
I learned early on that you pay close attention to what the nurses have to say.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, Truth, Courage, and Solutions. My name is Mackenzie Staninger, and I'm one of the hosts for this podcast. This episode, we will spend some time introducing the concepts and thoughts that went into the creation of this podcast, as well as what topics we will be focusing on over the course of the next few episodes. I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Cameron Kiersch, who is our professor who helped us create the podcast. Dr. Kiersch is a professor at Viterbo University and is the director of the Direct Entry MSN program. Dr. Kiersch received his DNP through the University of Minnesota. He is very passionate about climate change and the health impacts that can happen as a result of it. So, how did your idea for the podcast begin? Were there any extrinsic motivators or influences for the creation of this podcast?
That's a great question. I think, the podcast, who doesn't love listening to podcasts, right? Whether a long car trip or on a walk or whatever. And so the idea of the podcast really came from the creativity or the ability to offer students an opportunity to be creative and also to do something that maybe they haven't done before. And all of this plays into the bigger picture that really focuses on what I often tell students. It's more about the process than it is the product, right? And I think many of you who've been engaged in this process over the last semester can understand that no matter what you do when you're working with teams or you're accomplishing a task or working towards some specific goals, there are certain things that you just can't predict that are going to happen, different barriers and things that you're going to have to navigate. And that's really part of the basis of this work and this particular project and activity in this course. And as I said earlier, to utilize creativity. I think too often, especially in education, we eliminate students' abilities to be creative. And certainly, it probably speaks to a lot of different professions, but it certainly speaks to nursing and leadership within nursing, that one must be creative and we have to think about different ways to tackle different issues. And like I mentioned before, things that we could never predict. And the only way to really do that, right, is to think back to a specific point in time, potentially a specific project where we've encountered some of these challenges before, and then to utilize those skills to navigate it. And that's where I think a project like this that involves an entire class, y'all had to structure both your groups, you had to create your goals or deliverables, you had to establish forms of communication, you had to be accountable to each other and take responsibility. And all of that is part of being a highly effective team, right? And then naturally, the product is going to be great if you adhere to the process and navigate it with each other with these, common roles, goals, and norms, then the product is going to be fine. And that's what I really can't wait to see what has been created over the course of this semester. Now, this course in general, you talked about extrinsic motivators. I can't think of anything more motivating than trying to change our behaviors to save the earth that we live on. I really, and I know that seems rather dramatic, but when you start to think about the time and place in which we live and how important it is that we act and that we don't continue to behave in the ways that we have. And that's, what we often refer to as just blind consumerism. We just consume, and we just can't do that anymore. And I think, throughout, one of my key motivators and good friend, Dr. Shanda Demarest, was the first person to really connect climate change and healthcare. And I'll say this because I always considered myself, a climate activist or advocate, so to speak. But I'd never really thought about how healthcare contributed to climate change. And it was in my first semester course in my graduate program that I met Shanda, and she shared this passion with me. And once I started to connect those dots, it just became more and more evident. And also, I continued to recognize that this kind of work aligned both with my professional practice as a nurse and also my own personal interests as, again, a sustainability or a climate advocate. So that's kind of the, some of the backbone or the background of how this project really came to be, both utilizing students' ability to be creative and to work through projects and to work with team members to deliver on something and to utilize skills that then help them navigate a particular issue, and then to also help everybody make that connection between our role, our professional role as a nurse and as an advocate, and how advocating for action to mitigate the impacts of climate change are so critical at a time like this. And I do say, this book that I focused the course around, All We Can Save, which is edited, and I'm probably going to not pronounce these names correctly, I apologize, edited by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson, was a perfect launching point, I think, for students to connect some of these, certainly the health consequences of climate change, but also the actions that we can take. I think too often we think of climate change as doom and gloom, and we don't have any say in it. It's going to happen. So then what do? We just resort back to the path that's easier. And that's where this book really offers the truth, the courage, and the solutions for our climate crisis. And the one thing I want to read, just a quick little excerpt, and it's in the final chapter where the authors pull forward Rachel Carson and her publication from 1962, right? The Silent Spring, where they're referencing Robert Frost's poem. And she makes this reference here, and she says, "We stand now where two roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy. Just as I said, if we just keep doing what we're doing, it's easier. A smooth superhighway in which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster, right? The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. The choice, after all, is ours to make." And I think that's super profound in the sense of it's going to take action, and it's going to take all of us to do a little. And if we all do a little, we can start to, turn the course that we have established. And it's not doom and gloom, and we can do something about it. So that's those motivating factors, as you talked about, is, probably the two key or three key ones that I mentioned there: giving students an opportunity, centering it around something that is so critically important, and connecting it to our professional role as nurses.
Yeah, I think that's really fantastic. So you had touched on the fact that you wanted to give us an opportunity to experience the process of creating a podcast and a project like this, and also allowing us the creativity to do so. What impact do you also hope that this podcast has, not only for your master's level nursing students that are creating it, but also the individuals that are going to listen to it?
Oh, it's a great question, Mackenzie. I think certainly I hope each and every one of you, as you've gone through the process, can look back at this and say, wow, we really did something special. We created something. We worked together, even through, I know there have probably been some difficult situations. So I think that is in and of itself a great opportunity to learn. And if we just take a step back and think about that process, that can be, pretty powerful as well. The other thing is, as I said, getting everybody, I hope it's inspirational. One, for each of you to think, boy, I didn't think we were ever going to get this done. And at times it didn't seem like we were gonna, but we did, right? And I hope it's something you all can feel proud about. I hope it's something that you can share with others as a way to demonstrate what you all have created. But I also hope it inspires people to change. It makes us think. I always tell people, if even if you're conscious of a behavior, right? That's the first step, is awareness. Understanding that when I use a single-use plastic item, that thing's going to end up in a landfill and then most likely some kind of waterway, right? Or some other, natural area, right? It's never going to decompose. And if you're thinking about that, well, then that's the first step. It's that awareness piece that, you know what? Boy, I'm not going to buy this single-use piece of plastic, right? I'm going to buy something that I can reuse time and time again. Those little behaviors, or maybe, I'm not going to drive my car today. I'm going to walk to where I'm going, or ride a bike, or take public transportation. And then all of those little things, right? They start to stack up and they amount to something. And then in the end, I hope that we can start, these little behaviors will then hopefully provoke bigger behaviors. And that could be going out and maybe getting involved with a community organization or a local church or school or whatever, to maybe start a sustainability club, right? Or maybe it's within your neighborhood, those little actions. And then hopefully that then spills out into policy and the creation of policy that actually seeks to preserve, right? Or restore. And that's where I think we, meaning the collective we, have the most power, right? When we go to the polls and we elect leaders that want to make change, and they want to make change in a direction that honors certainly the earth that we live in, those inhabitants of said earth, and honors all voices. And I think it's impossible to address climate change, right, without recognizing systemic racism, inequities, and righting the wrongs of the past, right? And those two things are inextricably connected. I mean, there's just no way you can get around it. And again, that's why I say honors all voices, brings all voices to the table. And that's, again, another reason why I chose the text that I did, because it is written by women, right? And it is written with multiple Indigenous voices. And those are the voices that haven't been invited to the table. And that's what needs to be. Those are the voices that need to be invited to the table. And we even heard that most recently in the COP27. We're talking about smaller nations who are most impacted by climate change, right? And then these larger nations that are contributing to it, and the inequity in that, right? Who's suffering the most and who's contributing to the most are not the same. And so those pieces, I think, are vital as we start to tackle this most pressing issue. To get to the question, I hope that's what people take away, is to be radically inclusive of others, to partner with others. This cannot be done solo. It's going to take all of us. And I can't think of any better way to do it than to start with small incremental actions and hopefully lead to bigger, more substantial policy that advocates for equity and justice for all. So yeah, that's probably the biggest, or the inspiration that I would hope is taken from the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think it's really interesting how with this podcast and talking about just the climate inequities that we see, there is so much overlap that can be given to healthcare inequities. And as, future nurses, I think this is something that we can sort of compare and contrast from the variables that we've pulled from doing the research and putting this podcast together, and apply them to our everyday job as future nurses and how we impact with the populations that we care for. So yeah, I think that's really fantastic.
Absolutely.
So you had spoke on recognizing yourself as a climate advocate. How would you describe your personal relationship with climate change as, a healthcare provider and also a professor?
Oh, that's a good question. I kind of gave you a little bit of my history with when I first recognized healthcare's role in climate change. And boy, that really just set off a whole, it was a domino effect, right? As these dominoes started falling, I started connecting it to all these other issues. And that was really my first intentional leap into really educating myself about not only what healthcare can do, but what actions are being taken, right? Because it's not helpful to try and reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good things going on out there. Now we just need to build on them. And so that's where my connection or relationship with climate change really took off. I will say, I'm an avid cyclist. I'm a bike commuter. I've always been a bike commuter. Ever since I was back in undergrad, I've always seen that as not only a great way to get around, but also being climate conscious and climate, forward, so to speak. But I'll also say, I'm not perfect, and there's lots of things that I would like to do in my life that I make attempts to. And as I said earlier, it's all about starting with that awareness piece, right? I'm aware that eating meat, particularly beef or other red meat, is likely one of the biggest contributors to climate change outside of personal transportation. But that said, it's that awareness piece, and as we start to make these incremental changes, I think again, if each of us makes a little change here or a little change there, it adds up to something that's pretty astounding. And so that's initially where my interest in climate change as an individual really took root. As a nurse, I started connecting it to the health of my patients and in my communities, and it just became a really pretty natural connection that we should be advocating and doing more work to advocate for climate forward policy. Mm-hmm. And as an educator, I got into education because I knew that our healthcare system needs to change. And we mentioned a little bit about it here, the health inequities that we see within our system, those things need to change. And I thought to myself, well, what's the best way to do this? Yes, I can do that at the bedside and for my individual patients or in my community, it's very valuable. But I thought, well, an even more effective way to do this would be to educate future nurses to be climate conscious and really advocating for, like I said, the sustainability efforts that we're starting to see. And we're starting to see healthcare systems who are really buying into this and creating sustainability, partnerships or sustainability departments. And we can make those connections quite clearly as to why it matters to, again, not only our communities, but the patients that utilize our services. And I also think that empowering the future generations to really tackle this is what needs to happen. These are the generations that will be dealing with some of the greatest consequences of climate change. And so I think it's my responsibility to empower those future generations, not only to be knowledgeable about the topic, but also to understand how to lead change and how to create change and how to maybe generate a movement behind a specific action. And that's something that, again, this course and hopefully this project helps, as each of you have taken a different role and you've carried out, a pretty deep dive into the literature. You've talked to guests from around the region. You've put together a podcast that I think not only intends to inform, but also motivate, right? Mm-hmm. And that's pretty awesome. So I think handing over the mic, right? It's no longer mine to do. Hopefully each of you can go on from this course, from this program, and recognize that it's yours to do and that you have the tools to do it. And, maybe your passion won't be, advocating, at the policy level, but maybe it'll be something as, I mentioned earlier, getting active within your local community or even sharing the word within your family, right? About the little things that we can all do to turn the tables and start our drawdown, right? Of both our consumption of fossil fuels and hopefully improve our usage of renewable energy and all those good things. So I guess that's where I think most of my motivation for the podcast, what I hope each of you can take away. I'll end with this other piece from the text, All We Can Save. Again, this is in that last chapter, and this is actually their closing paragraph. And I think it actually speaks to what I hope each of us thinks about when we either, listen to this podcast or take action against climate change. And it starts like this. It says, "We hope this book embodies that kindred circle. If there is one theme that runs through the collection, it is ferocious love for one another, for Earth, for all beings, for justice, for a life-giving future. Let's move forward with love, not conquest, humility, not righteousness, generous curiosity, not hardened assumptions. It is a magnificent thing to be alive in a moment that matters so much. Listen to that one again, right? It is a magnificent thing to be alive in a moment that matters so much. Let's proceed with broken, open hearts, seeking truth, summoning courage, and focused on solutions. Boy, I could not have said that any better. Right?
It is awesome. It's quite beautiful, to be honest with you.
It's profound. It tells us that, yes, it's going to be hard, but if we do these things out of love, out of curiosity, out of inclusivity, then we can do it, right? And we can focus on solutions that actually make a difference. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just wanted to take the time to thank you for the time that you've dedicated to helping us with this podcast. And also thank you for believing in this cohort, for having the ability to complete such a project that not only has the capacity to be so impactful, but has also allowed us the opportunity to contribute to the fight against climate change. Big thank you again to Dr. Kiersch. Next episode, we will be discussing planetary boundaries with Dr. Teddy Potter.
If you are hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode, and for that, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We also want to extend our gratitude to our guest speakers who contributed so much to our understanding of climate-related health issues. The music you hear is Wanderlust by Scott Buckley, found on SoundCloud, promoted by Freestock Music Attribution 4.0 International CC by 4.0. A special thanks to Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson for their inspiration and guidance through their 2021 book, All We Can Save. From them came the framework for this podcast series, Truth, Courage, and Solutions. Viterbo University also gratefully acknowledges that it stands on lands and amidst waters stewarded by the Sioux, Sauk, Fox, and Hoocąk peoples. This has been an academic project of Viterbo University's Direct Entry Masters of Nursing Science students, 2022 through 2023 school year. We hope you enjoyed this new episode, and if you did, please tune in for next.